The opportunity to do this. I feel the Lord has led me to get more involved and hopefully use these opportunities to develop myself for further use in short-term missionary work and stuff. So I appreciate it. Also, it's a real honor to speak to you guys because you know the scriptures. And I believe you love the Lord as well. Our subject tonight is the Wesleys. Now this is a big subject because they covered most of the 18th century and had a profound effect upon Christianity as we know it today. Charles was born in 1707 and lived to 1788. That's a long time. And John, 1703 to 1791. What I'd also like to do, I'm going to give a biographical sketch, and I would like to kind of discuss some of the stuff that struck me from their life that was very interesting. They were brought up in a large family of 10. The 3 boys and 7 sisters. The 3 boys were their oldest brother, Samuel, who was named after their father, and then it was John and Charles. Their father was a Church of England minister, and he was educated in dissenting academics before returning to the Anglican Church. Their grandfathers were Puritan ministers, so they're from a long line of church people. Their mother was a strong influence in their lives in the area of theology and organization. I guess when you have that many kids, you gotta be organized anyway. But there's a lot of stories about them and their involvement in their parents' involvement in their lives, and the influence of their mother was she was a very strong woman. John left home at 10 to attend what we would consider now prep school in London, and Charles shortly thereafter followed him. Charles obtained and they went to Oxford University. In 1720, he obtained his BA, 1724 MA, and he graduated in 1727. Samuel, his older brother, also attended Oxford University. In 1728, he left Oxford to become his father's curate. I think that's like an assistant pastor or elder in the church. Then in 1729, he returned to Oxford at the request of Lincoln College. Oxford at the time was a liberal institution, and England itself was becoming very liberal in its approach to Christianity. John soon became the leader of a small group of students his brother had gathered. It was called the Holy Club. And I found this very interesting because it's seemingly the beginning of this small group influence in the church. And that had begun earlier in the 1700s in Europe. Clubs and societies had been formed for outside of the church. to kind of disciple or encourage the people towards holiness and that. And they were there, because irreligion and immorality was rampant in these things. And these clubs were called Methodists because of their approach to how they would, approach becoming holy and their exercise of Christianity. And I found this interesting because it has an effect on church today, the small group mentality and the way things are done. And it evolved into Methodism as we know it. They really put the method into Methodism by having people within the group lead the groups and, get people to participate. And I thought that was very interesting, the way they developed that. Some of the stuff they had the people do in the groups were, members were expected to make a serious endeavor to pray many times a day, partake of the Lord's Supper at least once a month, practice profound meekness and humility, examine themselves every night to determine good and evil they did, private fast once a month. All this stuff, this is stuff that we would think that we all should be doing, but they had these groups to help them do this. They're also they emphasized service to the community, the poor and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, his father in 1700 set up a small religious society in their hometown. So this kind of ran in their family. There's a story told of their mother who, when their father was out of town on business or in London, she would have devotions, and the people from the neighborhood would come and join her. And more and more people started coming and everything. And she wrote a letter to her husband telling him what was going on. And she told him, not to do it because, women and leading church-type meetings was frowned upon at that time. So she wrote him back and told him to write her a letter stating his objection to it, so that, when they stood before the Lord, that she would have evidence that, it was against his wishes. So I thought that was pretty good. But she did cut it out after she got the letter. Now, So, but that also later, women were involved in Methodism. They were allowed to do these meetings and stuff. So I just found it interesting, the development from the Holy Club to Methodism. This all started a general pattern of organization that was followed decades later from the Oxford experience, which evolved into Methodism. This was, it was also driven by John's own personal desire for holiness. And they pursued this path over their whole lifetime. They eventually started other groups. The group thing expanded, and they would visit other groups in the area and promote their social agenda of visiting prisons and helping the poor and stuff like that. He also
was keeping a diary of his pursuit of holiness. It's amazing the amount of documentation of these people. There's diaries and a lot of stuff is out there that you can see how this all developed. In a quote from his diary, he had written that his reliance on salvation was based on sincerity, and his hope of assurance was based on doing his best. I guess he got that from the Church of England, Anglican, the Catholic part of it, where you do your best. The works-oriented part of it was, he wrestled with that a lot. In 1734, his father was in bad health on his deathbed and advancing in age. He was asked by his father to succeed him in his Epsworth parish. John had declined already in 1733. John had a hard time deciding between college life and that of the rector of a parish. His question was to himself, how could he best serve God? He had a consultation with the local bishop, who told him his vows had put him under no obligation to take the parish as long as he could do better serving God elsewhere. 2 months later, he faced his father on his deathbed and told him he would ask the Bishop of London about taking the church. The bishop declined to get involved. Shortly after this, his father died. John helped with the parish and the family during this period of transition. Then he left them and went back to Oxford. John became more and more into the fanatical practices of fasting, getting up at 4 a.m. to pray, and various methods of self-denial during this time. He would preach about the circumcision of the heart, training all of one's affections upon the will of God, and his becoming part of this eventually became part of the Wesley doctrine of holiness in Christian perfectionism, which I thought was interesting too, that they had this doctrinal belief of sinless perfection, which I found very interesting. I don't know how what you guys think of that, but I thought it was pretty interesting. And that sinless perfection became a distinctive hallmark of Methodist theology in the 18th century. Shortly after, he talked to the bishop in London. He didn't get involved. So then, shortly after that, he returned to Oxford, was contacted by a friend about going to Georgia to help Oglethorpe in the new colony. This turned out to be an alternative to taking over his father's church, and yet a way of fulfilling his father's desire for him to be involved in full-time service. With the encouragement of friends from the Holy Club and family, the decision was made to go to Georgia. John's plan was to be a missionary to the Indians and a minister to the settlers. Charles was going to be Oglethorpe's secretary. So they decided to go to Georgia. They were convinced by friends and family to go. And that was, the New World would convince his call to Georgia was of God, would promote that grand end, which was the motivating goal behind it, was John, well, let me see. John said that he would be assured if at once fully converted himself, he would then God would employ him both to strengthen my brethren and preach his name to the Gentiles. That was the very ends of the earth may see the salvation of the Lord. That was his quote in his diary. It seems, I got the impression that he was never really assured of his salvation this whole time. He was struggling with his relationship with the Lord the whole time. So they get on the boat, and they're sailing for the New World. The Wesleys had never been on a ship before. And soon, the winter crossing became rough with storms, which caused Wesley to give deep concentration of death. With death staring him in the face, it exposed the frailty of his sense of assurance, and the question of his salvation took on a new sense of urgency. His fear of death, he felt, was a testimony to his lack of faith. I found it interesting that for years, he had been preaching to these societies and clubs and stuff, and he wasn't, as it turned out, saved at the time. I found that very interesting. Maybe that speaks to the anemic nature of the Anglican Church, Church of England. I'm not sure. I don't know how rampant that was, but it seemed to me that it wouldn't be conducive to the spirituality of the congregants to be ministered to by somebody who wasn't in the faith. Anyway, there were repeated storms on their journey over to America, and during the third and worst storm, just a week before sighting land, it really touched Wesley, and he submitted himself to the wise, holy, gracious will of God. It also opened his eyes to the depth of his faith of the German Moravians on board. During the storm, Charles was worshiping with the Moravians at their evening service. The sea spilled over the ship and split the mainsail and poured between the decks. The English passengers were screaming in fright, and the Germans calmly continued to sing their psalms without interruption. Wesley was greatly impressed by the Moravians. Faith in the face of death, Wesley noted in his journal, "This was the most glorious day which I have hitherto seen." And later, the Moravians would have a great effect on his spiritual life. Wesley set foot in Georgia on February 6, 1736. Upon arriving, Wesley came under the discipleship of the German pietists, the Moravians, who he admired for their faith and assurance that they had. They counseled Wesley as to his personal state of salvation, pressing the quotation that was at the heart of the problem. Does the Spirit of God, they asked him, does the Spirit of God bear witness with your spirit that you are a child of God? John gave all the right answers to them, but recorded in his journal, "I fear they were just vain words." Wesley continued to contact with them through his stay in Georgia. Wesley's first contact with the Indians of Georgia came when he met with one of their head chiefs who warned the Wesleys and their friends not to evangelize in the Spanish manner. He would rather they instruct first than baptize. I guess the Spanish people were Catholics. The chief's father had been killed because he wouldn't be baptized. The Wesleys were invited to the chief's village a week later. When they went and the Indians were gone. The mission got off to a bad start, and it seems never got much better. He did have success in starting a religious society in Savannah, school for children. He also tried to convert both white and black slaves. One feature of the Wesleys brought to Georgia was the use of hymnals. They published the first English hymnal in America. John Wesley also had a personal interest there, and this I found pretty interesting too. John Wesley also had a personal interest in a lady named Sophie Hopkey. John apparently misinterpreted the relationship when she married somebody else, and he was devastated. He found in the eyes of the parish priest her duplicitous behavior and her lack of penance led him to bar her from communion, which was a public affront to her husband. So her husband brings a series of charges against Wesley to the grand jury in Savannah. In combination with the division in the community caused by his actions regarding Sophie Hopkey, his manner of ministry provided grounds for the most of the charges leveled against him. Some of the charges were that he deviated from the principles and regulations of the established church, such as introducing unauthorized innovations and novelties into the church hymn singing, restricting the Lord's Supper to a small group who would confess to and conform to penances, confessions, mortifications, and constant attendance to early and late hours of prayer. As it turned out, his enemies never enjoyed the pleasure of his conviction. However, since Wesley jumped bail and abruptly departed from the colony in December 1737 before any trial could be held. I thought that was really interesting. Another thing was that he sails, and his brother had left earlier because he had gotten sick with his lung got some kind of lung thing where his lung got inflamed and stuff and wasn't breathing. So he left and went back to England even before John did. So they sailed back, and George Whitefield was leaving for America when he arrived, and John told him not to go to America, but George Whitefield went anyway. So I thought that was pretty interesting. He returned on the return from Georgia. About a week after returning to London, the Wesleys started to meet with a Moravian named Peter Bowler, who was a mentor to them. Bowler was also a Moravian. He encouraged them to come to faith in Christ. Charles, who had been suffering from this inflammation of the lungs, and was now recovering, was reading Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians about the free gift of faith through free grace of God, Galatians 2:20. He came to faith in Jesus Christ. John, about the same time, at an evening meeting of the Adler Street Society, he also, as someone was at this meeting, someone was reading Luther's preface to Romans, Wesley's heart was strangely warmed. With joy, he joined his brother in their mutual discovery of the faith. I just find it, I'd like to know what you feel about how he could go this long in his spiritual journey and not be saved. I mean, I just found it very interesting that, you know, this is like 10 years and he's not even saved. I mean, I thought that was, thank God he came to faith in Christ. But yes, Pastor.
Yeah, and that's, I think it's an interesting point to hit on. And of course, you remember that Rome had taught, if you're in the church, you're saved, right? And so then they're from the Anglican church, which had really that as its root idea. If you're in the church, you're in the kingdom of God. And so you would practice whatever the church practices, right? So then he finds a different situation. I think the Moravians did influence him a lot, Whitfield as well. And then, what is it called, Aldersgate?
Yeah.
His heart was strangely warm, which is, yeah, I guess you read something on that. And
Yeah.
and it seems different to where your salvation is personal and not just perfunctory, just a matter of doing things. You know, I do think it's easy in religiosity to come to meetings, to engage in things, to give, and all these practices, yet you may not have a genuine regenerate heart.
Yeah, in the Church of England at the time, they believed if you were baptized as an infant, you were saved. So I guess he just proceeded upon the assumption that he was in the faith, but there was no assurance of that fact. So, well, I found John was saved at this Addergate Street meeting. Shortly after, upon the urging of George Whitfield, who, it was interesting that back in the Oxford days, Whitfield was also a member of this holy club. So while the Wesleys were in Georgia, Whitfield had kind of taken leadership of this group and had been preaching throughout London and the other societies. And a revival was starting. And most of their success came, and as you remember, this was the start of the Industrial Revolution in England. And most of their early meetings were in these industrial coal mining areas, Newcastle, and it was like this triangular area. So Whitfield was having such great success that he asked John Wesley to come and help him, because Wesley was recognized as a great organizer of groups. So he goes to Bristol to help him, and they organize the people who had recently got saved and stuff into these societies, and for the purpose of discipling them. At first, though, I also learned that Wesley hesitated about, as we learned last week, he hesitated about doing outdoor preaching because he didn't think it was appropriate to preach in a non-consecrated, area. I thought that was interesting. Nevertheless, on April 2nd, 1739, he preached to about 3,000 people, and what has been termed the Wesleyan revival had begun. Charles joined the work, helped organize multitude of converts into small groups for Christian nurture and discipleship. John Wesley's Methodism was more than a theology. It was an understanding of the Christian life which stressed a joyful, personal relationship with a loving Father, God, expressed through worship and loving action towards others. Love for the lost, evangelism, love for the poor meant social concerns, health clinics, food, school. Love for the new converts was small group studies. I think they published over the course of his lifetime 400 publications. The Wesley's love for the nations caused him to travel to America, Germany, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. Eventually, he helped send preachers to America. The Wesley's personal effects were formidable. During their 52 years of preaching, they averaged 4,000 miles a year and preached more than 40,000 sermons in all. That's a lot of traveling by horseback. I'm running out of time. Let me conclude by saying his real genius was his ability to enlist, organize, and develop the spiritual talents of others. A lot of the people who were involved in the Methodist movement were uneducated working people who they discipled into spreading and developing Methodism, which is still a large denomination in America. They help build a denomination. Through a growing structure of small groups, local leaders, and traveling preachers, they never lost sight of the need to nurture and disciple those newly won to Christ. And that's about all I got.
Well, I just saw the parallel between what Wesley went through with Martin Luther, the same kinds of struggles. And then it was really interesting that both of the Wesleys were reading or studying or being preached to from Luther's commentaries, and the Lord used the scripture, but people to wake them up. I mean, to get the Holy Spirit to awaken them.
That's very true. The Moravians are I would think, a branch off of Lutheranism, because they were like from Germany and stuff, and they kind of evolved from the Lutheran, school of thought. So.
Anyone else? I have a quick question. Plus or minus on the Holy Club. What was your reaction to it? Think good? What's good, positive, what's negative?
I think it was a good thing because it stimulated a group of men to go out and evangelize and promote, holiness and of character. And it was an effort to revive the church. I think it was, and it did have a lasting effect. Although at times it could be interpreted as works-oriented, but it did, I think it had a good effect on, it's kind of, they helped evangelize, they changed the course of Christianity, or the Holy Spirit through them, changed the course of the church in general. Well, now these are parachurch organizations now, and the Wesleys never wanted to start their own denomination. They wanted to revitalize the Church of England, Anglican Church. It was never their intention for a denomination. So I think it was a positive effect.
And the only danger was legalism, more or less, potential.
Yes.
Very good.
And it did. I found out later that it, into the 18th century, some of these practices were still continued in the Methodist Church in America. It's really interesting stuff.
You did a great job. Thanks for informing.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Jared,